Well, welcome back to the NRW Virtual Investor Conference. Great to have you here with us. Next up is Cluey. Cluey is an innovative ASX-listed edtech company that combines, so it's in the name, education, technology, and data to deliver high-quality education outcomes and enhanced experience for students. It has a very highly experienced management team and board with a track record of building successful education businesses, and is also supported by an independent education advisory board, which comprised of 4 eminent independent, education sector thought leaders. So Cluey has been recognized already in the prestigious Hold On IQ inaugural list of the most innovative edtech companies in Australia. While we're all being impacted by COVID as we speak, and education and school systems are continuing to deal with a real structural shift in learning, with children now learning more online than offline. And that shift to online learning, has created a learning inequality gap. And given the shifting landscape, CEO Mark Rold will discuss how Cluey is positioning itself for this shift and whether we will continue to see this narrative play out post-COVID. So for anyone in the audience, again, if you would like to ask a question, you can do so throughout the presentation just by using the button at the bottom of your screen. We will get to your questions at the end of the presentation. We will welcome now Mark Rold, who's the CEO of Cluey.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I'll start off by giving you a brief overview of who Cluey is and what we do and the problem that we're solving. And then we'll talk about some of the more interesting and dynamic factors that we're seeing emerge in the school-based learning market and the structural shifts that we're participating in. If you look at a classroom today, it looks remarkably familiar because fundamentally very little has changed over the last 100 years in school-based learning. We put the same students going at the same pace, learning the same content of the same age in front of the same teacher. And on the flip side of that, we have extensive standardized testing where we're able to determine that every child is at a different place in their learning journey. And then we try and put those kids into the same structural environment of a classroom, and we can't deal with the challenge of having to solve each child's individual learning issues. And as a result of this, we've seen continuing declining results in the performance of Australian school children globally. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. This is not a funding problem. We've had continuous increases in government expenditure in the school-based system. And when we look at this gap that's emerging with learning, and this is long before COVID, this is really important to understand, the proportion of students performing far outside the median group increased each year and increases each year significantly after year 3. So the gap gets wider and wider. And the Grattan Institute came out with some interesting research where they indicated that the existing achievement gap is more than 10 times greater than the gap that would have developed during the COVID-19 disruption, which means we've had a problem for a long time. COVID's just made the problem worse. So parents and students are, turn to outside of the classroom for a lot of their learning support. And this is a big market. There are 4 million school students in Australia, and around 1.6 million of these students use tutoring or test preparation in the last 12 months or are considering using it going forward. And a further 2 million of the 4 million school students use other forms of learning support, whether it's paid or unpaid. So people know they have a problem. It's not being resolved in the traditional classroom environment. They're turning outside of the classroom to try and resolve it. When people turn outside of the classroom to support their learning, there are really kind of 2 key categories. There's tutoring-based learning support, which is a big piece of this market, and then other learning support. And when we look at tutoring, it has also been highly traditional. There have been 2 key forms. One, a personal tutor that comes to your home or you go to the tutor. We call that the pay and pray model. You have no real idea of what the tutor is doing with your child. Or you put your child into a learning center, which is a better version of a classroom. Smaller number of students, an expert educator or tutor trying to guide the student through their learning. And then the model that Cluey has built and designed, which is online tutoring, where we use a lot of big data and learning analytics to power the learning. And as you move across more and more to the online option, That provides the ability to significantly scale and use technology to deliver high quality services. It's important to understand that tutoring and test prep is only one part of the learning support market. There are many other learning supports that parents and students turn to. For example, learning content being physical and digital textbooks or study guides. They'll use classroom resources, or they'll move to apps and games where they'll be able to kind of sit in front of a screen and kind of go asynchronously through the learning content. When we designed the Cluey teaching and learning model, we started from scratch. In 2017, we said, if we want to solve the learning problems for millions of school children, how would we design it? What would it look like? And what would make it different? And we said for great teaching and learning to occur, 4 key elements are required. It's not just about matching a student with a tutor. It all starts with a comprehensive learning plan designed for that student, with all the content in the learning plan, digitally designed, fully mapped, scoped, and sequenced to the curriculum. We then match the student with a tutor, a mentor, and a guide who works through the curriculum with them in live learning sessions online using the digital content and all the support tools. We then provide targeted practice between the learning sessions to reinforce the concepts. And then we record every single learning interaction with that student. We'll talk about that shortly. And we use that data to deliver detailed progress reporting, defining what the student knows, what the student doesn't know, and what the student needs to do next. And then we reconfigure their learning plan based on their coverage and mastery of the syllabus. So technology is at the core of what Cluey does. We have built, designed, and developed and integrated our own live learning and practice environments where we have fully synchronous, which is two-way, audio, video, content, text-based chat, and collaborative whiteboards. We have session guidance and notifications that we can now flag live in session. And we have full integration with our enterprise platforms. And our enterprise platform enables us to scale our business significantly, where we can manage in an automated way at scale things like student and tutor scheduling, account management, and service configuration. One of the key questions that I'm often asked is, how do we use data? And we use data really in 2 key ways. We turn data into insights. We record each video track of the tutor, the video track of the student, the audio track of the tutor, the audio track of the student, the content that's consumed, the order of that content consumption, how much time was spent on the content, what the student got right, what the student got wrong. And we keep each of these in their separate streams. We then summarize the session performance from a tutor perspective. So we're able to evaluate how the tutor has performed, and this guides further improvements in the learning and the teaching by the tutor. We then turn the insights into outcomes where we automatically analyze what and how a student is learning in every session by parsing this data through our AI and our platforms. And we're able to generate a model of their subject performance and mastery. We know what the student knows, we know what the student doesn't know, and we know what the student needs to do next. And this underpins our scalable service model that enables us to provide consistently high quality learning as we grow. And we use this data to optimize the tutor match with the student, to adapt the questions and the content based on the type of performance that the student is showing in session. We can make live real-time recommendations to the tutor in the session, pull back on the question level, add more content. We can automatically reconfigure the teaching and learning content in the learning plan in order to optimize the learning for the student, based not only on the feedback, which is qualitative from the tutor, but on the quantitative data and analytics. So the big question then is, how are school students dealing with a structural shift in learning with children moving online at scale and as a result of the COVID shift? We've had major problems with our school system in Australia long before COVID. The school model as we know it is highly traditional and industrialized, with hardly anything changing in over 100 years. It's this one-size-fits-all model where we put the same students in the same age in the same class, learning the same content, going at the same pace, learning from the same teacher. And for some time, we've known this is a major problem. Trying to educate our children en masse via this production line model that was designed and developed during the Industrial Revolution. And changing this system has been near impossible due to the rigidity of the infrastructure-based school model, government funding mechanisms, and this traditional teacher mindset. What we've needed is more of a service model rather than a product model, where the service is customized or personalized for different learners at different points in their learning journey. And this should embrace the learning that happens in school and outside of school. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. If you look at some of the performance stats, they are frightening. Australia, for example, in 2018, our students were more than a year behind 15-year-old Australian students who sat those original same tests in the early 2000s. And Australian research shows that achievement in a typical class, a year 7 class, can stretch across or spread across 5 to 8 year levels. So that means you can have a student working at year 1 level while others have mastered concepts at year 8 level. So, what has happened with the shift to online learning and the impact of COVID? Now, with a shift to online that's been accelerated by COVID, we're seeing unprecedented change. With almost no warning, parents, teachers, and children found themselves in this massive experiment, trying to discover new ways to teach and learn and new ways of distributing responsibilities across home, school, and work. COVID-19 has disrupted education on a scale never seen before. By mid-April 2020, nearly 90% of the world's learners were no longer attending classrooms. And this crisis has forced schools to embrace technology, whereas in the past, they'd been very slow adopters. COVID has already changed school-based learning in many ways. This is the beginning of a fundamental transformation that is not gradual. It feels much more like a seismic shift. It's driving a revolution of innovation in school-based education that finally is accelerating change and out-of-the-box thinking. Suddenly, parents, teachers, students, politicians, education policymakers, and researchers have placed education front of mind. It's the topic at the dinner table. And this is prompting the recognition of the need to change. The 3 R's, which are the 3 basic skills that have been taught in schools for the last 200 years, namely reading, writing, and arithmetic, are now joined by what I refer to as a 4th R, reimagine. So let's see what that looks like. So how are schools changing to cope with this shift to online? Firstly, not all schools have changed equally or well. Some have simply reverted to the old correspondence model of emailing PDFs or Word documents and asking students to fill in forms and then emailing them back to the schools. Others have tried to simply emulate the offline model online using tools like Zoom or Teams. And some, but not many yet, are trying to fully embrace new technologies using data and learning analytics to identify individual student needs and break out of this production line model, trying to deliver a true personalized service experience. And they're looking for real-time data on student progress and well-being. On the positive side, we're seeing some schools embrace technology. Data-driven teaching and learning technologies are providing insights that are convincing even some of the greatest naysayers of change to reimagine pedagogy, which is the philosophy of the way we teach, school structures, and culture. And it's not surprising that children in the main adapt to this pretty easily. After all, they are the most digitally native humans the world has ever known. Teachers who effectively deploy online learning tools are able to operate more as mentors, coaches, and guides. And by providing students with high quality, comprehensive online content, this enables those students who are more self-directed learners to progress further and faster without the need for as much time from their teacher. And this then frees teachers up to provide support to those students who require additional help. Parents are now much more involved in their children's learning. For the first time, many parents are experiencing firsthand how their children are coping, where their difficulties are, and looking for ways to support them. This is changing the fundamental relationships between students, teachers, and parents. Parents are no longer willing to live in a world of asymmetric information when it comes to their children's learning. They want certainty, validation, and detailed information. Simply relying on the next report card or the parent-teacher information evening is no longer going to be enough. In all likelihood, gone are the days of parents meeting teachers at the school once a term. Parents are now going to expect to meet teachers with their kids via Zoom call during a lunch break, at the office, or in the evening. Online learning brings more choice. Students are no longer limited conceptually to attending a school by virtue of where they live. In those schools where they have limited numbers of students wanting to enroll in a specific subject, schools can now group these students to combine them into small classes and share teaching resources. And from a construct perspective, schools are recognizing that the traditional classroom is now destined to change. Students and teachers have now got used to working collaboratively in groups or teams rather than being siloed in rows and columns. After all, that's how the real world works. We are going to need flexible, data-centric learning spaces that will look much more like the spaces adults want to work in. And interestingly, some functions and jobs are rapidly under threat. I think a lot about roles such as libraries and librarians. Who's going to use these services going forward? And then there's a growing acceptance that the generation-old concept of the school day is changing. Most students who have studied online through COVID do not start at 8:30 a.m. and run through to 3:30 p.m. Their timetables have been reorganized, and there is clearer delineation between class lesson time, assignment time, and regular breaks. This is truly starting to reshape the way we think about how schools should operate. Some examples of ideas we've been thinking of. What if schools only operated 2.5 days a week and students studied online for 2.5 days a week? Or what if teenage students did their schooling in the afternoons and younger students studied in the morning to better align with their circadian rhythm? In either of these two cases or examples, we'd need half the amount of physical infrastructure, saving billions of dollars of funding that would enable us to pay our teachers substantially more, attract talent into the classroom, and provide the very best technology tools for every child. On the flip side, COVID has also impacted education negatively. Some of the more obvious issues are reduced one-to-one engagement with teachers. Parents are under extensive pressure trying to support their children's learning from home. Teachers are working longer hours and under more pressure and stress trying to navigate this world of digital delivery, one which most, if hardly any, have ever been trained for. And then there's the mental well-being that's being impacted as a result of social isolation. Finally, there are kids with special needs who are not necessarily being adequately supported. And then there's the question that I'm asked a lot, the big issue of access and equity. Not all students, families, or schools have access to technology, the internet, and resources to support and deliver great online learning. So let's talk a little bit about this inequality gap. This has been exacerbated by the shift online and COVID. Students, families, or schools that have not been able to access the technology, internet, and resources required have often had a very poor experience. And unfortunately, this is most prevalent in lower socioeconomic households where there may not even be a computer or multiple children all relying on one computer. The problem is obvious. For many of these students, their education is effectively ground to a halt. The evidence is now starting to emerge, and this is concerning. In the UK, by March 2021, primary school pupils had fallen nearly 3 months behind. In Australia, the Grattan Institute identified that significant learning gaps have been created due to COVID. Early indications from global studies suggest that it is students from the disadvantaged backgrounds who have been impacted the most as a result of COVID disruptions to their schooling. And as a result, governments in countries like the UK and Australia have announced significant funding for small group tutoring as the most efficient and effective way to try and address these gaps. This format of learning support, tutoring, is something we're very familiar with, and we've been delivering this extensively for some time. A great outcome for Cluey is that we were recently selected by the New South Wales Department of Education as an approved provider of small group tutoring to schools across New South Wales. So how is Cluey positioned for this shift? How are we benefiting from it? How are we coping with it? Cluey was designed and built from the bottom up for a fully digital learning experience. This includes the building of the entire Australian curriculum in maths, English, and chemistry digitally. We've delivered over 380,000 online, face-to-face online tutoring sessions where we measure over 100,000 data points in every session and have a data lake of more than 17 billion data points. Our in-house data science capabilities enables us to quality assure every learning interaction. And we deliver highly optimized, personalized learning for our students to augment what they're learning at school. When we launched our service to the market in 2018, the big question investors were asking me was, will school students move online for their learning? That question has now been answered. Then the question became, can you deliver great teaching and learning for school children online? That question has now been answered. I think the question that's now being asked is, should be asked is, can you actually deliver great teaching and learning in a traditional classroom? We were experiencing significant growth in our business prior to COVID. COVID simply accelerated the shift, and we're continuing to see the momentum in this shift to online. I'm going to give you a quick snapshot of how we benefited from this shift to online and how this has flowed through in our numbers. As I said, COVID has been an accelerator on top of the significant growth that we've been experiencing over the last 3 years. In our most recent quarter, when most, if not all, students in Australia were back in regular schooling in the classroom, Cluey continued to accelerate its growth with record revenues, record new students, and record student sessions. In FY21, we increased our new students by 2.3x. We increased student sessions 3x, and we increased revenues 3.3x, and at the same time increased gross profit by 3.7x. In terms of our key operating metrics, the business is continuing to scale rapidly with record revenues, record new students, and record student sessions. Revenue in Q4 21 was 5.6 million, an increase of 135% on the prior corresponding period. And this exceeded revenues of 4.9 million for the entire previous financial year. New students was 5,800, an increase of 105% on the prior corresponding period. 88,000 live online student sessions were completed in Q4 alone, an increase of 135% on the prior corresponding period. And this exceeded the total number of student sessions completed in the previous financial year. And we did this all by maintaining a variable customer acquisition cost of $552 in line with our forecast. And this was notwithstanding the 135% increase in the number of new students and 250% increase on brand investment. Interestingly, this quarter alone, 14% of our total media was spent on brand activity. In terms of some of our key operating metrics, active students, we achieved 15,500 active students in the second half of the financial year. This is an increase of 131% in the prior corresponding period. And since 2019, our students have grown at a compound annual rate of 263%. In terms of revenues, we generated revenue of 15.87 million in the financial year 21, which reflects an increase of 226% on 2020 revenue of 4.9 million. And we've got a compound annual growth rate of 320% on FY19 revenues. What's most pleasing for me is that in the current quarter, we are continuing to see the significant take-up of our services and continuing and ongoing scaling of the business. I think it would probably be a good idea for me to stop the share and to turn to Q&A.
Well, thank you, Mark. I can hear your enthusiasm about the Cluey product and all of the opportunities that have come to the fore, particularly through COVID. What is the plan for future growth in terms of acceptance within the school system itself?
That's a great question. I think for some time, schools and teachers kind of looked at tutoring as something that happened on the side. Most schools would not openly endorse tutoring as they saw it as almost an admission on their part that they were failing to deliver. And that was notwithstanding the fact that many school teachers actually are tutors. That world has now changed. For the first time ever, we are seeing governments, education departments, and schools contracting with private providers such as Cluey to actually bring tutoring into the classroom, to bring it in as a service to address the personalized needs of each student. For example, last year, we were commissioned by the Department of Education in New South Wales to run a pilot across 6 public schools, where we focused on trying to support those students who came from educationally disadvantaged backgrounds. So I think there is an increasing acceptance and acknowledgement that the two live well together and live well side by side. And I think going forward, increasingly we will see parents who send their kids to schools for the regular school teaching or learning experience, and they will then couple that with personalized, adaptive tutoring, learning support, and test preparation in order to optimize their children's learning. And we've seen that happening in international markets already.
And what metrics do you have as to the life cycle of a student in the Cluey universe? I mean, are your students on average coming in for really targeted tutoring support, or is it sort of something that you can follow a student through the arc of their?
Yep, that's a good question. We have 3 types of students. We have those who are always on. They get tutored in 52 weeks of the year. We have those who are mostly on. They get tutoring typically 36 weeks of the year. They step out during the school holidays. And then we have those students who are sometimes on. They typically will come in for 6, 7, 8 weeks at a time, get intensive tutoring and support in a particular area that they need help with. They'll bow out. They'll then come back in further down the line, and then they'll bow out. I think it's also important to note that we think about it more and more at the family level rather than at the individual student level. We see families moving their spending around. So they might put one of the kids in for a NAPLAN test preparation program with us for 10 weeks. Then that child comes out, they put one of the other kids in for maths for 16 weeks. That child will come out, then they'll put their daughter in for English for 12 weeks. So there is no single homogeneous way in which these students learn, but we typically see the 3 components. So in the lowest period of our operations, which is December, January, we typically will continue to run at around 50% of the usual level of tutoring that will run during a core school term. What's also interesting is like the majority of our students, 51% of our students are in primary schools, which means we have extensive lifetime value that we can create over time, because there's no reason to believe that those students won't be with us through their entire school journey.
We have a question coming in saying, can you talk to your advisory board and what sort of value they provide with their industry experience?
Yeah, so the key reason why we have an education advisory board is to bring to the table independent third-party views, analysis and validation of our teaching and learning model. In order to be successful as an ed tech company, at its core, we must deliver great teaching and learning. We've built what we believe to be the ideal pedagogical approach to teaching and learning. We need to make sure we don't drink our own Kool-Aid. So our independent advisory board are there to ensure that we are measuring the right metrics. We are constantly reviewing student satisfaction, efficacy of the service, student performance, tutoring performance, and that as we build out more and more AI, we are validating the outcomes from our AI relative to the independent assessment of what quality teaching and learning looks like. And they are there to ensure that we maintain this quality as the business continues to scale. You know, a year ago, we were running 10,000 sessions in a month. We're now moving to 40,000 sessions in a month. It's all very well scaling. You must have those processes or the capabilities to ensure the quality. So we have experts. That's, for example, Professor Gary Falloon is an expert in the integration of technology and school-based learning. We have Andrew Pierpoint, who represents the School Principals Association, that gives us insight into how schools are thinking about the services we provide, how they're thinking about integrating them, and how we ensure that we dovetail in what Cluey does with the school syllabus and the curriculum, so that we're always focusing on the teaching and learning that makes a real difference.
And where do you get your tutors, your mentors? Where do you find them?
So we have around 1,200 tutors across the country at the moment. Around 30% of our tutors are school teachers, current or retired, and around 70% of our tutors are university students. We love using university students. They're highly cognate in the discipline. They're passionate about the subject matter. They're digitally natives, and they interact with students in a way that is different to the formal instructor-led approach of a school teacher. What they lack is the content, the curriculum, the scoping and sequencing, the infrastructure to make sure that the teaching and learning happens in a particular way and order, and that everything is optimized to the syllabus and the curriculum. And that's what Cluey brings. We bring all of that to put around those uni students to enable them to deliver brilliant teaching and learning experience. So when you think about the pool of talent, there are around 1 million domestic students in the university. For us to recruit 5, 10, 15,000 of these students to teach maths and English is not difficult. The ability to quality assure it and train and develop them, that's key to the success of Cluey.
We are out of time for Cluey today, at least. Mark, thank you so much for the presentation.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Mark Rold there, who's CEO of Cluey.